Howdy y'all, I'm David Crockett, fresh from the backwoods. I'm half horse, half alligator, and a little touch to a snapping turtle. I got the fastest racehorse, surest rifle, prettiest sister, and the ugliest dog in the district. My old man can lick anybody in Tennessee, and I can lick my old man. I can outgrin a panther, hug any bear too close for comfort, and eat any man alive opposed to Andy Jackson. You just grease him, pin his ears back, and I'll swallow him whole. Now, some folks, especially when I was in Congress, they took a lot of pride in saying a lot about nothing, like I'm doing right now. But I wish I may be shot if I don't give you a little bit of story about myself. Well, I was born around these here parts, August 17th, 1786, to parents John and Rebecca Crockett. But whether by day or by night, I don't know, for if I've been told, I have forgotten. Now, I grew up poor like most other folks here in the backwoods, but we didn't realize it because everybody else around us was poor. But we got on some time renting grounds and paying high rents until my pa finally moved us up to set up a tavern in Morristown, Tennessee. Well, it was that time I started having a lot of adventures of my own, whether willingly or unwillingly. First of them being my pa at the age of 12 sold me out to a Dutchman named Jacob Seiler to drive cattle all the way to Virginia. Well, I got home and took to having 3 days worth of schooling before I got into a fight with a bully at the schoolhouse. And I know that the bully was going to tell the schoolmaster on me, so in order to avoid a whipping, I played truant. But after a few days of being gone, the master, he wrote a letter to my pa asking why I hadn't been showing up to school. My pa, he got mighty nettled about this, and he told me, he said, if you don't go back to school, I'll give you an eternal sight whipping worse than what the master will give you. You're wasting the hard-earned money I'm putting for your education. And that's when I reckon every young fella, he's got to have himself a time where he mouths off to his folks and it bites him in the butt. That's exactly what happened, for I went up and told him no. Why, he lit out after me with that hickory switch of his, and soon we was up to our top speeds running down the road, but mind me, it wasn't the schoolhouse road, for I was trying to get far the other way as possible. Well, in that time, after I outdistanced my pa, I took to hiring myself out to do a lot of various forms of work. I was a wagoner, cattle driver, a hatter, and at one point I almost signed on a voyage to London as a cabin boy. Now, at the time I didn't know where London was, no more than a place on the moon. But I wish I may be shot if I was more than willing to go there, if only to avoid the whipping. Well, in about 2 years' time, I finally got tired of my traveling and thought often of home and wished badly enough to be there. So, by hook and by crook, I made my way back to the tavern where my pa and ma, who had all given me up for dead, received me with open arms again and shed many a tear on my account. And I tell you, to this day, I would have faced 100 whippings rather than put my family through what I did in them 2 years. Now, shortly after, I started laying into work for a Quaker. And in that time, I had a few love scrapes, and I also become mighty fond of the rifle, and I bought a capital one at that point. But after getting jilted a few times in my love affairs, well, I finally met the prettiest girl in the backwoods. Polly Finley was her name. She was my first wife. Well, we had a good few years, and we had 3 children between the two of us. I found I was better at increasing my family than my fortune. Now, there was a time that disrupted the peace and tranquility of our married life together, and that was when the Creek War broke out. Down in Mississippi Territory, there's about creeks botched up about 400 men, women, and children at Fort Mims and massacred every last one of them. And I became nettled at this, and I know that my dander was up and only war could put it right again. So that's when I went ahead and told Polly I'm off to fight. She shed many a tear on my account and begged me not to go. But I told her if every man was willing to wait for his wife to let him go off to war, while we all be scalped and burned up in our cabins. So I went on down to Camp Blunt at the muster with the regulars and the militia, and I found myself under the command of none other than old Hickory, Andrew Jackson himself. I was part of a detachment that did most of the scouting down in there. Of course, I was one of the main scouts, fetching in meat for the campfires and things like that. John Coffey and Major Gibson, they was some good fellas as ever was. We had a heap of fighting down in there. One incident I will never forget as long as I live, and that was my first fight, Taloosahatchee. We got there, formed our ring around the village, and started moving in, and made our lines tighter and tighter as we advanced. Now, when the Injuns saw us, they come out firing. And we gave them fire and they returned as best they could. But soon they saw that they was our property, so they retreated back to the safety of their cabins. At one point I counted upwards of 46 Creek warriors that hid in this one cabin. And as we approached that cabin, a little old squaw sitting there on the front, and she had a bow and arrow in her hands, and she notched up an arrow and drew back, and she shot one of our sergeants clean through. Now, this is the first time I ever saw a man killed with a bow and arrow. It wasn't a pretty sight by any means. But the sight so enraged us all that we fired upon the old lady, and before she hit the ground there was 20 balls plumb through her. And that's when we went ahead and set fire to the cabin. And we could hear them Injuns in there screaming for their gods. The next morning, we heard that there was a fine chance of potatoes in the cellar. Now, we had nary to eat but parched corn for about 3 weeks on end. And when we found them potatoes, we ate till we nearly burst. Though I wish I could say it not. For they'd been cooked by the grease that run off them engines. That part in and of itself sickened me very much so, and I only took part in one more battle during the whole Creek War, the Battle of Talladega as it was. Afterwards, I had a few more scouting expeditions down to Florida Territory and whatnot, trying to wipe out the remains of the Creeks after Horseshoe Bend, Jackson's decisive victory against them. But there weren't much fighting down there. So I went ahead and paid a boy the remainder of my term of service to go ahead and take care of my part. That's when I went up to Tennessee again, and that ended my career as a warrior. I'm mighty glad of it, for if I'd kept fooling about in war this way, I would have got used up at it. But as soon as I got back, I was hit with another hard blow. For that's when death, the cruel leveler of all people, entered my humble home and took from me a good and affectionate wife, and from my children a tender and loving mother. It wasn't too long after, there was a widow nearby. Her name's Elizabeth Patton. She was a good woman. She had a passel of kids herself, and ours was a marriage of convenience, but don't get me wrong, I did have feelings for her. Still do to this day. She's a good mother, and she puts up with me for when I'm home, coming in from Congress and things like that. Why, I'm either out hunting and she's still tending the children and tending to whatever crops we have. But it was at that time, after I married her, we moved to Lawrenceburg, and I started setting myself up as a reputable hunter, and folks took to point me out and saying I ought to be magistrate. Now at the time, I'd had not more than 3 days of schooling in all my life. And it was the easiest job in the world before we had a whole heap of folks coming into the backwoods. For at the time, if I wanted to serve out a warrant on someone, all I had to do was tell one of my deputies, you go here and you go to John Doe's farm, and you bring him back and we'll try him as seen fit. But once we started getting more folks, why, we needed to have more records. So I not only had to write out the warrants, but attach my name to them. And to do this with the little education I had was a huckleberry above my persimmon. Well, I reckon I done a good enough job, for some folks started saying I ought to run for Tennessee State Legislature. And that was when I come up with my own brand of politicking. For I had Elizabeth make up a nice jacket made of buckskin, and 2 big pockets in the front. And in one I had a bottle of whiskey, the other a twist of tobacco. So whenever I was along the campaign trail and I seen a fella, I'd offer him a dram. And he'd out with his quid and take a drink, and then afterwards I'd offer him another chaw. And in that way, whether or not I got the fella's vote, why, I left him in his first rate of humor as when I met him. I don't know if that helped to sweeten the deal of me getting elected to the legislature, but I don't think it hurt none either. I must have done a pretty good job there as well, for soon enough I found myself being elected to one of the highest points in the nation, the U.S. Congress. And I got there in some time. I was fresh from the cane. In fact, some of my political opponents, they took to calling me the gentleman from the cane. And at first I was nettled by this. But it wasn't long I started adopting it, owning up to it, and used it as my own form of advertising myself, as none other than King of the Wild Frontier. For I told them I could leap further, swim under longer, and come out drier from the Mississippi than any fella in the East Coast, and I could climb up a honey locust and skin down it without so much as a scratch. I was the toughest congressman around, I guarantee it. Well, I had a lot of dealings in Congress. I avoided a duel narrowly at one point, and at one point I even saved the president's life when a would-be assassin come out and tried to kill the president just so he could set himself up as King of America. But I wish I may be shot if I don't regret it in some way, for it was when I opposed Andrew Jackson and his constituents in 1834 regarding this here Indian removal bill, why they went ahead and tried to make a complete mash of me and did everything they could to get me out of Congress. My last opponent, before I lost my last bid here for re-election, was none other than Adam Huntsman. He was a veteran of the Creek War, losing his right leg. And sure enough, when the votes were counted, he won hands down. And I told all my constituents, back where I lived at, I told them, I said, I told you all my platform many a time, whether I was campaigning or no. And I told you that more than that, if you was to see fit to elect me to Congress, well, I'd go ahead and represent you as honest as I could. But seeing as how you've seen fit to elect a man with a timber toe to succeed me, why, you may all go to hell. I'm going to Texas. Well, here I am now, August. I got about one more month before I get ready to make my way out there. I've heard there's a little political upheaval and civil unrest down there. And so they're needing a call for volunteers down Texas ways. And they said if you was to sign the oath for militia duty, you'd receive 640 acres of your own choosing. Well, I reckon what have I got to lose? For from what I've heard, by the time I get down there, the fighting's all going to be over with. All I got to do is serve 6 months in the militia and receive my land, build a cabin, and come back here and bring my family down. But whatever happens in this here new territory, I don't know. It'll be in the hands of Providence. But regardless, I'll leave this for others when I'm dead. Always be sure you're right and go ahead.